Welcome to the American Historical Association's Congressional Briefing on housing, specifically or largely the role of the federal government in the provision of housing, and in this case focused largely on cities, but not completely. I'm Jim Grossman. I'm the Executive Director of the American Historical Association. And just very quickly, raise of hands, how many of you have been to one of these congressional briefings before? Okay. It's a very provisional raise of hands. I want to provide a little bit of context for what we'll be doing this morning. The AHA's congressional briefings date back to 2005. I will not ask how many of you have been to a congressional briefing between 2000. Yeah, Dane is probably the only one who was at one in 2005. We provide congressional staff, journalists, and others in the policy community with the historical background necessary to understand the context of current legislative concerns. The program rests on the premise that everything has a history, and that anyone involved in influencing policies, decisions of any kind, whether in the corporate, nonprofit, government world, ought to understand how past events and policies have shaped the current landscape. It's impossible to thoughtfully consider housing policy without understanding what we have tried or not tried, how things have worked or not worked, and what can be learned from all of this, and including the caveat that just because something hasn't worked doesn't mean it couldn't work. Our second premise is that it is possible to provide that historical context in a manner that is nonpartisan, which is, I know, or those of you who work in the Capitol and associated buildings, it's a word that one does not hear very often in this part of Washington, D.C., but we try to be nonpartisan, and we also tell our panelists, please, that everything they say should be unencumbered by their advocacy concerns and political commitments. We do not want to be advancing a particular legislation agenda, and we ask all of our speakers to adhere to that standard. In this case, I think that there is one premise that we have, in essence, assumed to be an advocacy basis for this session, which is that there should be a federal role in housing. So that we do have a position on that, otherwise we wouldn't be here. We're grateful to the Mellon Foundation for providing the financial resources that make this work possible. My AHA colleagues, Alex Levy and Ben Rosenbaum, who are here, actually do all the work. I just stand up here and talk. And please email us with any ideas for topics for future briefings, or just come up to one of us afterwards, write something down, whatever. If you're inspired by any topic that is sitting in front of Congress, please let us know, and we'll try to figure out if we can organize this kind of conversation around it. We have 11,000 members, a little bit more than that, and we can find a historian to speak on any topic, and I really mean any topic. So, with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers and then get out of the way. I'm going to assume that everybody has picked up our essential and brilliantly written handout, which has information about our speakers. If not, subtly raise your hand, and my colleague Ben Rosenbaum will slip you a copy of the handout. I actually have these written down in the order in which people are speaking, which is totally accidental. But this is the order in which they will be speaking. Lizabeth Cohen, professor of history at Harvard University, is the author of 3 influential books. Lots of people, by the way, have written 3 books, but few have written 3 influential books. 2 of these books have won the prestigious Bancroft Prize, which is very unusual. The most recent and relevant here is Saving America's Cities, Ed Logue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age. I suspect that none of you know who Ed Logue was. Read the book. and you will find out why you don't know who he was and why you should know. Nathan Connolly, Associate Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. Is Johns Hopkins and Ohio State the only ones that insist on the? I don't know either. I think it might. Directs the Hopkins program in racism, Oregon State. Directs the Hopkins program in racism, immigration, and citizenship. His award-winning book, A World More Concrete, Real Estate and the Remaking of Jim Crow, South Florida, is about metropolitan Miami, but it's about a lot more than that. And again, read the book and you'll see why. Read the book and then look around to your nearest metropolitan area and ask comparable questions. And your assumptions and your perspectives are likely to change. I can assure you of that, having read the book carefully. D. Bradford Hunt is Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at Loyola University, Chicago. He used to be the Vice President for Research and Academic Programs at the Newberry Library, which I mention only because I had that job for many years and am therefore in good position to admire what he's accomplished. He's the author of Blueprint for Disaster, The Unraveling of Chicago Public Housing, and the co-author of Planning Chicago. Living and working on Capitol Hill, I am well aware that staffers here and more often not in this room, are often inclined to roll their eyes at the naivete of academics with regard to the politics of the federal budget. Please note, Brad has served on the staff of the House Budget Committee and as legislative director to Congressman Mark Newman, Republican from Wisconsin. So I would argue that he actually does understand the politics of the federal budget. So Liz is going to start, and then Nathan, and then Brad, and then there will be some conversation among them, and then we will take questions. You have on your chairs a 3x5 index card. Please, as you're listening, any questions that you have, write on the card. Ben and maybe other AHA staff will come around and collect them, and then we'll pose them to our group. We use 3x5 index cards in order to, all of you have been to events where questions take 7 or 8 minutes and you ask people what their question is. You only have a 3x5 index card, so you are limited in what you can ask. But please, as you're listening, if anything occurs to you at all, write it down and we'll throw it out here. So, Liz, you're going to start.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thanks for coming. I'm going to get us started with a kind of overview of the issue. And, oops, now it's on. Okay. And let me just start by making the point that there is little doubt that we have a serious affordable housing problem today in most American communities. And just let me share some basic data with you. The national home ownership rate has fallen from a high of 69% in 2004, that was before the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis, to a bit short today of 66%, with a substantial racial gap. In 2021, 73% of white Americans were homeowners versus 44% of African Americans and 51% of Hispanics. Homeownership also skews old, whereas 79% of people who are 65 and older own their own homes, only 39% of those under 35 do. A second point, an unprecedented number, close to half of American renters are what's called in the business rent challenged, allocating at least a third of their pre-tax earnings for rent, with a quarter of Americans spending at least 50% of their income on rent, and in many places it's even higher than that. Third point, homelessness is on the rise. The current rate is estimated to have risen 10% in the last year, in contrast to the previous 2 years' rate increase of 0.3%. Point four, the wait list for the most visible federal housing programs, which I would say includes public housing and Section 8 housing choice vouchers, today are extremely long. People can wait years to gain access. And I did some random checks just online, In San Diego, the website says that the average wait time is 12 to 15 years. And in Bergen County, New Jersey, it's nearly 14 years on average. Public housing is often hard to get, but also when you get it in terrible condition, with little funding available to most local housing authorities for updating and rehabilitation. A recent estimate has been that much needed capital improvements the value of those improvements would be about $70 billion. Fifth point, and this is an interesting one, I think. In 2022, more than half, 51%, of rental construction projects were for luxury apartments. And that's in contrast just in 2000 when it was only 34%. Moreover, they're often these new projects in gentrifying neighborhoods, thereby worsening the housing options for those with low incomes. And I could go on, but I hope you get the point that we do have a huge crisis in affordable housing. The mayor of Toledo, Ohio, recently estimated that the country needs about 7 million more affordable housing units. So the question before us today is, how did we get here? And I think the challenge for you is, what can we do about it? In my 10 minutes, I'm going to try to lay out the history of housing policy over the 20th and 21st century. We're talking here about a century and a quarter. So for clarity's sake, I'm going to simplify things down to 3 phases over these 125 years, though there's certainly more variation within each of those phases. Phase 1 would be sort of 1900 to 1930, pre-New Deal of the 1930s, when private solutions to housing dominated, with some participation of nonprofit philanthropy. Phase 2 would be 1930 to 1975, what historians tend to call the New Deal order, when the federal government played a substantial role in housing. And phase 3 would be 1975 to today. With the rise of neoliberal market fundamentalism, we've seen a retrenchment from direct government interventions in favor of private market solutions, sometimes facilitated by governments, as well as some nonprofit efforts through CDCs, community development corporations, though many of those are very much underfunded and just scrambling to survive. So let's take these 3 phases in turn. That first phase, 1900 to 1930, is the simplest. There was just very little federal government involvement in housing provision. Housing provision rested mostly in the private sector. Perhaps surprisingly to people today, I think, home ownership rates were relatively low compared to our expectations today, with many residents renting their homes, even those who were in the middle class or upper middle class. In 1920, for example, only 45.6% of Americans owned their own homes. That's less than half. There were only short-term mortgages available. A 30-year mortgage had not come in. And the American dream at that point did not necessarily include owning your own home. This was a period, as many of you probably know, of major immigration to the United States, and with it, the growth of many urban slums in major cities. Low-income residents tended to live in tenement-type buildings, and the only regulation of those buildings for light, for ventilation, for design generally came from minimal standard building codes that were set by municipalities and by states, and often they weren't enforced. And out of that kind of disaster in many cities came a housing reform movement and something that was called model tenements, trying to model what a good tenement would look like. But economic support for that was really minimal, and what there was tended to come from nonprofit philanthropy. And even within that nonprofit philanthropy, there were philanthropists who argued that they should get some kind of return on their investment. So the second phase, 1930 to 1975, marks the height of the federal government's intervention in housing provision. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was the key turning point in introducing federally funded housing, and it consisted of a range of approaches. First would be, here we started to see the building of public housing projects, beginning in the late 1930s. Originally, many of them were low garden apartment type buildings They often required income tests to actually get access. You had to show that you earned a decent living to be able to pay your rent. And they usually were racially segregated, dependent on and put in the neighborhood where that was where one racial group dominated. Only later, after World War II, did we start to see those high-rise public housing towers that many of us are familiar with. Second approach was that during the Great Depression, to keep the housing market afloat and people in their homes, the federal government supported the refinancing of home loans through federal government-insured mortgages. And that happened through programs like the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration. These, as you may know, these programs were often suffered from redlining, discriminating on the grounds of race, ethnicity, and gender. World War II intensified what had become a really acute housing crisis. Remember, 10 years of a Great Depression followed by the war. There was a real crunch when people, soldiers came home. A lot of knew this is when the baby boomer families really took off, and there were new families being formed. And the solution that the United States came to was to embrace accelerating suburban development and urban decline. First, the suburban boom. The United States could have gone in a number of directions. Many people were living in cities that could have looked for urban solutions, but where we chose to go was to encourage the private sector to develop what is a kind of mass suburbanization, assisted by the federal government, and that's an important point. The growth in home ownership rates were huge. From 1940 to 1960, the rate of home ownership rose 18%, from 43% to 62% of households. And government, just to reiterate that point, government assistance made this mass suburbanization possible. They did that through the GI Bills, veterans mortgages that were cheap and available to most GIs, not all, FHA funding to developers and home buyers. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 led to the construction of 41,000 miles of the interstate, which made it possible for people to live in a suburb and still work in a city, as well as access other resources. That was the largest public works project to date when it happened. Tax benefits to homeowners, mortgage interest, and property tax deductions. And as a result, by 1980, home ownership rates reached 66% of households. And that's actually a tiny bit less than it is, tiny bit higher than it is today. And again, I would just reiterate that you're going to find many more white households owning homes in 1980 as you do today. Meanwhile, cities were in big trouble with suburbanization, as white middle-class taxpayers increasingly were exiting for suburbia. We often refer to this as white flight. And at the same time, northern cities were attracting African Americans from the South who came looking for good jobs in industry as well as better places to live. And this led to public housing, which continued to be built, becoming increasingly low income. And cities were faced not only then with this loss of white middle-class taxpayers, but also with a decline in capital investments by businesses, by industry, and by retailers as many businesses moved out to suburban business and industrial parks and so forth, shopping malls in the suburbs. The Housing Act of 1949 and similar acts that followed it aimed to address the challenge of facing cities, promising, and I quote, a decent home and a decent environment for every American. Well, that didn't happen, but that was the aspiration. It was to be achieved through providing much more support for mortgage insurance, funding for slum clearance and renewal, and significant increase in public housing. This and subsequent acts led to the creation of a cabinet-level Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, the building of housing for seniors, subsidies that kept rents at 30% of household income, and many more things that maybe will come out in the other talks. The general urban renewal strategy was for the feds to write down the cost of land and its preparation so that developers would be incentivized to develop projects in cities rather than in suburbs. There was some encouragement as well for nonprofits to build housing. But as you may know, urban renewal was also controversial, particularly in that earliest period of the 1950s, for its excessive demolition of what often were low-income minority neighborhoods close to downtown, and a lack of community input in decision-making. The third phase, 1975 to today, reflects a shift from public sector involvement to new strategies for incentivizing the private sector to take the lead in providing housing. And those strategies include, first, the predominant method that today we use to fund affordable housing, low-income housing tax credits, which are implemented by the states. And the approach is that investors, often corporations, get tax credits against their federal taxes for contributing to housing projects, which in turn then reduces the cost of construction and rents, at least theoretically. Second approach are the Section 8 housing choice vouchers, where, again, theoretically, recipients could take a voucher subsidy to a landlord, has to be a landlord willing to accept it, in a community that they want to live in, and it is often one that might have better schools, better transportation, and other resources. Third, that's affecting our current housing situation is demolition of public housing and its replacement with programs like Hope 6 that privatize public housing and/or made projects mixed income to lower costs to housing authorities, and also perhaps a worthy goal to avoid concentrations of poverty. But that has resulted in losing as many as 15,000 public housing units each year. And most recently, since the foreclosure crisis of 2007-10, venture capitalists have been buying up housing, particularly when mortgages are defaulted on, and then renting them out at high prices to repay their investments, in some cases to the very people who had owned that home, who then were unable to keep up their mortgage payments. And the fifth point I would just point to, on a local level, many cities have implemented inclusionary zoning, requiring developers to develop a certain percentage, to offer a certain percentage of affordable units in order to get approval for a market rate project. And generally, it's about 15%. Or in some cities, they could pay into an affordable housing fund, and then it would tend to be put in a neighborhood where there, is a need and people are amenable to having it. But crucially, and this would be the point I'd want you to take, all of these approaches of this era, this last phase, depend on the private market working in people's interests and require cooperative private sector actors, whether they are landlords, developers, corporations seeking tax shelters, and investors. And alongside these obstacles to affordable rental housing has been, as I mentioned at the start, a drop in home ownership rates, nationally. So in conclusion, your challenge, I would say, is to figure out how to address this situation. But it does seem to me, and here I may be venturing into territory I'm not supposed to go, that we have become overly dependent on the private sector to solve these problems, and it has only contributed more to their growth. The federal government's money, I would argue, is really needed, but I would also say that it is not the only answer to all aspects of this problem. I'm sure you're aware that suburban NIMBY resistance to zoning for greater density and affordability is a major obstacle in many metropolitan areas. But I think the big question before us is, can we increase government subsidies to help create more affordable housing and do so in a way that avoids the pitfalls that very much plague the urban renewal era? And I'll just leave you with one more thought. Although off and on over the post-war period, there has been some attention to how to innovate in housing design and materials that are used in construction to lessen the costs and increase the supply and the speed of building, there hasn't really been very much improvement in that. In fact, the money for developers and contractors is to be made, as you saw, in luxury building, market price building, doing it the old-fashioned way. So I would, end on the question, what can we do to incentivize more innovation in housing construction, such as using prefabrication, along with providing more housing finance? Stop there.
Nathan?
I sure hope you people know what you're getting into. This is the party line of one Carl Lindler, head of the New Neighbors Orientation Committee for the Clybourne Park Improvement Association. A fictional character from a fictional community, Mr. Lindler appears in Lorraine Hansberry's 1959 play, A Raisin in the Sun. There he serves to embody the genteel, reasoned side of American racism. The younger family bought a house in all-white Clybourne Park and was about to become that community's first African-American resident. It fell to Mr. Lindler to dissuade the youngers from moving in. I'm sure you people must be aware that some of the incidents which have happened in various parts of the city when colored people have moved into the area. The Clybourne Park Association empowered Mr. Lindler to buy out the youngers, but Walter, after considerable ambivalence and his mother's shaming, finds the moral footing to reject the buyout offer. Failing to move son or mother to reconsider, Mr. Lindler then issues his final cautionary remark, speaking as he had been for all of Clybourne Park's white residents. I sure hope you people know what you're getting into. Now, I hear in that line not the voice of a make-believe man or his homeowners association. I hear the voice of a very real black playwright, Hansberry, speaking to America about its democratic promises. Promises too long, I would argue, tethered to housing. I sure hope you people know what you're getting into. The American experiment of private home ownership promised to grant people all the rights, benefits, privileges they have earned. Earned. That's the supposed magic of a house in this country. It translates labor, forbearance, and even hope into rights. These include rights to privacy and shelter, access to other possibilities in the attainment of wealth, and with it, security across generations. Parting warnings or a son's waffling be damned, the younger family bought that damn house at 406 Clybourne Street, and as Walter explained to Mr. Lindler, have decided to move into that house because my father, he earned it for us, brick by brick. But as I'll detail in my remarks this morning, there's a danger in political and the economic magic of a house. There's a danger, in fact, to the national experiment of transforming rights once promised as inalienable into rights earned. Federal, state, and local housing policy, all through the All-American House, took our country's seemingly universal entitlements and poured them into a hierarchical vessel. As long as certain people hadn't exhibited the capacity to earn certain rights, our national experiment held. Now, over at least a century, the policies related to ownership and occupancy of houses might be considered our effort to salvage that experimental fusing of shelter and democracy, of trying to at once promise rights for all and rights at a price. There have been 4 ways in which American housing policy has answered the same question, a most important question. What is a house? We have policies that understand a house as shelter, policies that cast it as an investment, policies that consecrate the house as a cultural symbol, and policies that treat the house as a base unit of national prosperity. Still, across all these meanings, I'd argue, what we in policy circles regard as, count as, a house, has created a series of hazardous and largely false divisions in the protections we extend to residential America. As depicted in A Raisin in the Sun and far too many cultural texts to name, we tend to understand that a house is based on what we believe it isn't. A house isn't an apartment. It isn't a place dominated by landlords. It isn't a dwelling under your occupancy but out of your control. When we think of poor people, and especially people of color, renting, we tend to imagine towering buildings in northern communities like the Bronx, Harlem, or Chicago's South Side. By contrast, we associate paint and gardens and renovations with a particular kind of shelter a house provides. Close your eyes. Picture it. Now, we may try to strip the image of a house in our mind's eye from the typical racial association with whiteness, but you have to try to do that. In this tangle of assumptions, and for some of us, attempted cognitive revisions, we only affirm how little we understand about what our housing policy has already done and what, in attempting to correct it, we're getting ourselves into. Let me make things a little more concrete with an example from the world just off stage from Hansberry's play, The Black South. At no time in the history of the United States have the majority of black people lived outside the South. Never. And at no point has black ownership reached more than 50%. That means that historically, the black renter was predominantly a Southern renter, and the Southern rental was, in most instances, the cheaply built rental house. For decades, this meant one-story wooden houses, not often sleepy woods in Mississippi somewhere, but crammed in the so-called colored districts of bustling southern cities like Atlanta, New Orleans, or Jacksonville. These houses remained practically invisible to federal policy, as we've heard, until the late 1930s, and certainly invisible to our popular memory even today. We have federal housing policy to thank for our collective amnesia. We generally recognize today that during the 1930s, federal housing policy leaned heavily into liberalizing the terms of home ownership, including the creation of the 30-year mortgage, as we've heard. It remains largely overlooked, though, that government agencies like the Federal Housing Administration, the Federal Savings and Loans Insurance Corporation, and the Federal National Mortgage Association marketed loan products and services that naturalize the cultural and policy meaning of a house. Through a web of newly available federal mortgage insurances, government-protected lending institutions, and a federally created secondary mortgage market, a house got fashioned politically and culturally as that which was white-occupied, single-family, detached, the fruit of free market forces, and the building block of a productive nation. But here's where the story gets more interesting. Landlords, especially those who depended on black rents, recognized what was happening at the time. Some even named it as a kind of discrimination. And for more than a decade, between the mid-1930s and late 1940s, landlords lobbied for access to their own pipeline of federally funded mortgage products. This eventually arrived in the Housing Acts of 1949 and 1954, which included a bundle of lesser-known slum clearance, urban renewal, and mortgage insurance provisions specifically for rental property owners. Enter yet another history overshadowed by mythic depictions of a house. During the Jim Crow era of the late 1940s and early 50s, federal housing policy allowed urban slum owners to redirect their investment dollars towards suburban development and infill urban redevelopment. Again, we think we know the story of the Federal Housing Administration and its exclusion of non-white families hoping to access single-family homes. What we don't appreciate, though, is how, in 1950, an astounding 99% of new rental units purchased by landlords in the United States enjoyed mortgage insurance from the Federal Housing Administration. 99%. Our inability to treat the house problem and the rental problem as a single policy problem ensured a certain continuity to Jim Crow. White families who fled the Liberty City neighborhood of Greater Miami, for example, wound up owning a greater percentage of black-occupied housing in 1968 than white families owned in 1928. Post-Jim Crow, white ownership of black communities actually went up in many places. This was entirely on account of the rental house. Faced with black in-migration from urban redevelopment happening elsewhere, white families often exited their inner-ring suburban homes and, on account of home equity and easy access to new credit, left the old house in the old neighborhood as an income-generating rental property. Go back to the same community 50 years later, now 2018. Sea level rise in South Florida made the old segregated neighborhoods prime targets for what's been called climate gentrification. And it's again been the South Florida rental house, this time as a landing ground for Section 8 vouchers that, in the face of poor alternatives, helped scatter the last residents of the city's few remaining public housing projects, displacing hundreds of black families. Let me cut to the chase. In American housing policy, we have severed the story of landlords and month-to-month profiteering from how we talk about the all-American house. In so doing, we have produced reams of housing policy that have proven unable to prevent the kinds of recurrent predatory behavior that has not just taken advantage of inequality, not just actively produced it, but that has also made our entire housing system and society at large incredibly and recurrently unstable. When policymakers in the late 1960s attempted to reform the Federal Housing Administration and create a set of new loan products for minority home buyers, they assumed non-white buyers made for riskier borrowers. FHA provisions thus included lavish subsidies for lenders' interest payments. In short order, around 1973, 40% of the budget for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, some $1.8 billion, went into lenders' pockets as interest. In the late 1970s and early 80s, policymakers again tinkered with the financial supports meant for buying houses. This time, they repurposed the old Federal Savings and Loan Association for its provisions from 1934. They took thrifts, which were intended to protect the prospect of single-family home buying, and allow these S&Ls to begin buying up commercial real estate, high-interest deposits, and junk bonds. But again, instead of helping the housing sector, this had the opposite effect. Appraisers took on every manner of bribe to falsely inflate bank portfolios. Some home builders left the game completely, as one could now, with a little help from Washington. One could buy a $2 billion bank for as little as 0.8% down. And by 1990, S&L recklessness nearly collapsed the entire financial sector, costing some $500 billion in taxpayer money. Once you begin to see the pattern effects of our policy fetish for the house as an idea, once you see the cost of our well-meaning blindness, it's difficult to unsee. Tax liens that effectively turns one's home into a rental situation. The mortgage meltdown of 2008. In 2015, the Washington Post ran a series called Dashed Dreams. It featured African and West Indian immigrants who in the booming 90s and 2000s moved into suburban D.C., only to see white real estate developers and dummy corporations move in and convert owner communities to renter communities. Such danger is neither unique to today's D.C. suburbs, the Jim Crow suburbs of the 60s, or even the fictional house at 406 Clyburn Road that welcomed a still largely broke younger family. For more than 2 decades, more than half of all Americans living under the poverty line live in suburbia. I close with this. Owning is not the opposite of renting. The two work together. Prices of homes and apartments are set in relation to each other. And even as an owner, one can quickly slip into the precarities of renting. Our housing policy thus needs to be more concerned with curbing predatory economics than believing in the magic of home ownership, than preserving the mythos of the house. Culturally, we're likely never going to talk glowingly about the all-American apartment or regard anything associated with rental property with the reverence we afford the white picket fence. Nor is it the policy question before us whether we should encourage or discourage home ownership in the abstract. Let us instead consider the history of the house, a more sober, desegregated history, and ask, what has the house been, really, and what we've already gotten ourselves into? Starting with those questions, uncomfortable as they may be, invite us to consider how we might make home ownership safer, and more important, how we can extend to renters the same autonomy, security, and equity benefits we conjure with the word house. Thank you. Right.
Thank you. I want to build on the comments of Professors Cohen and Connolly and also do a deep dive into the public housing program and the low-income housing program and tie together this broad arc that Professor Cohen mentioned and this really interesting ideas around home, almost a humanities-based take. I'm really enthralled with that. The public housing story is often defined as one of failure in U.S. housing policy history. I want to complicate that. There were certainly failures in execution of policy, but there's also a lot that we've learned, and I think now we have learned those lessons, but now we're unwilling to fund a new set of affordable housing initiatives that the set of affordable housing initiatives that we've come to know in a way that meets the demand that you described. So I want to take you back to the 1930s, the New Deal. There was a certain optimism among progressives, even in the depths of that depression, that government could solve the problem of housing. And then at the time, there were two major ideas. One is that bad housing was causing bad social outcomes. that the physical environment that people lived in determined whether they would grow up to be responsible citizens. If people didn't have indoor plumbing and didn't have light and air in their rooms and were overcrowded or living in dilapidated buildings that might burn down, that this was a bad social outcome. In many ways, we have changed over the last 100 years, 90 years, the problem of substandard housing. We talk about affordability now. We used to talk about condition of housing. The second big argument that progressives made was that the housing market was one that had fundamental market failure. That for the previous century, we had been a belief that, the market can solve this problem. It was obvious by the Depression, and it's been obvious ever since, that the private market cannot address the full housing needs of Americans. And that's just a fundamental point that I think I want to make here, that the market cannot get it done. We need a government at various levels, in various ways, in a whole range of programs to address our housing problems. In the 1930s, progressives looked to European models. Some of those European models subsidized the construction of new housing. Some of it subsidized specific tenants, specific people who needed help. Some of those European models were state-owned and state-run. Some of them were more run in partnership with nonprofits, run by associations or unions, and that it was a public-private, public-nonprofit partnership. America in the 1930s, in the 1937 Housing Act, really focused on a government, federal program that was in partnership with local governments. It's a complicated arrangement, but let me give you the basic financial structure of the what we think of as the traditional public housing program that was predominant from the 1930s through the 1960s. The federal government paid the capital costs of new affordable housing, the construction costs, clear the land, build the buildings. And then the local housing authorities, local government agencies, would manage that housing and were expected to maintain that housing using tenant rents. And the reason that it could be affordable to residents is because the housing authorities were essentially nonprofit. They weren't trying to make money. They had no borrowing costs because the federal government had paid to build those projects, and they made very small tax payments, heavily discounted taxes. So you remove the profits, you remove the taxes, you remove the mortgage, and now you're only charging enough rent to maintain the buildings. That should get you low rent housing. And this works for several decades. Public housing residents described the new buildings that all of a sudden had private bathrooms and enough space for their children and landscaping and playgrounds and things. They described this as public housing as paradise, that this was a step up from the previous slums that they had lived in, that these were well-run, well-managed projects. The rents coming in for predominantly working class and poor residents could provide enough income to the local housing authorities to maintain these relatively new buildings. But let's not forget the problems that were all beneath the surface there that were eventually going to overwhelm the public housing program. One is about race, and we've heard Professor Connolly about the formation of housing as a white ideal. The other piece of that is that white politicians in these communities did not want integration, either in a community basis or even integration within public housing developments, for the most part. There are exceptions, and there are interesting exceptions. But race was going to drive where these buildings were built. In cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, New Orleans, I could go on and on, the white power structure said, we need to build these in existing neighborhoods in neighborhoods where African Americans are already living. And in essence, as one historian, Arnold Hirsch, put it, we built a second ghetto on top of the old ghetto, on top of the first one. We tore down black communities that had substandard buildings, and we built new public housing in its place, and race was central to those decisions. Similarly, racial integration was simply not going to happen. And so public housing over this time period is going to become perceived by Americans as a racialized program, a program for African Americans, even though more than half of residents, at no time were the majority of residents black. By far and away, the majority of them were white. As the program evolves and through the 1950s and 1960s, we're going to have a couple problems. One is that some of these designs weren't well thought through. I'm not going to put everything on design. I don't want anybody to think, oh, that was the design, those high rises, those ugly buildings, that's what did it. There are ugly buildings all across the country. There are high rises all across the country where lots of people live. High rise buildings can function. It did prove problematic for low-income families, particularly families with children. And I've made the argument in my book about Chicago that the problem, one problem there, on top of many, and I'm going to go through the others, was that planners decided that the families that needed housing most were the families with large children, with many children. So if you were a large family, yes, thank you. If you had a large family with 4 kids, a landlord is not going to rent to you, or you're going to be priced out of a 3-bedroom apartment. And so the Housing Authority in Chicago built most of their housing units after 1950 in high-rise buildings with 3, 4, and 5-bedroom apartments. This is going to concentrate youth at extraordinary rates and add to the management problem of how do we keep the elevators running? How do we keep the lights in the hallways? How do we keep the plumbing working? And elevators are fragile, they're expensive, and as elevators in particular broke down, it's going to break down the functioning of the building, and people with options are going to leave. The next problem I'm going to point to I'm getting in the weeds here, but I think it's a management problem to some extent, that the way the rental structures were created. So the idea initially was that rent would be what we call flat rate, just like you all pay. You pay X amount a month, whether you make $1 million or whether you make $50,000. In public housing, and this was codified in a series of amendments in Congress, known as the Brooke Amendments, that said that your rent is going to be set as a proportion of your income. Great. You don't want people to be paying too much of their income towards rent. And if we set that at, say, 30% of your income, so if you make $1,000, you're going to pay a month, you're going to pay $300 a month in rent. That over time is going to create incentive for the very poor to get into public housing and to stay. And it's also going to create incentive for upwardly mobile families to leave. If your rent's going to go up every time you get a pay raise, you're going to start to say, well, maybe I ought to go somewhere else. And this is going to concentrate poverty. Now, this is a solvable problem. You can create a new subsidy structure for public housing. You can have additional federal subsidies to recognize, hey, these are low-income tenants. They cannot pay enough rent to maintain the building, to fix the roof, to fix the plumbing. That's going to be the 1970s story. Congress is never going to authorize or appropriate enough funds for these local housing authorities to maintain their buildings. They're going to go into a downward spiral, just like any other private building in the country. So this is not a story of government failure in terms of, government can't run housing. It's a problem of funding, to some extent design, to some extent concentrated poverty, to some extent concentrated youth. And Congress is just not going to have the political will, and you can start to understand why if we remember the racialized nature of public housing. Our suburban congressmen, our downstate congressmen, our rural congressmen going to vote for more public housing funding when everybody's low income, and the perception is that everybody's African American. And so there's just this disinvestment over the 1970s. We're going to hit a crisis in 1972 when St. Louis demolishes in a very visible way with dynamite a large project called Pruitt-Igoe. It's going to be a front page story. The Nixon administration in 73 is going to call for a moratorium on all new housing. This is looking at, it's public housing in crisis. Most public housing developments were still functioning fine. Okay, that New York City, large, huge authority with all sorts of high-rise buildings, was still doing very well. And so the program gets tainted and tarnished around issues of failure, that are going to really continue a downward spiral. New York's going to hang on. It's now struggling in part because now these buildings are 60, 50, 67 years old, and the capital funding to replace the roof, to replace the elevators has not happened. And any other building, you have to do that. That has not happened. I'm going to finish by saying that a couple harder lessons from the public housing program. One, that housing is a complicated social good. It is not something where a one-size-fits-all model is going to work. Public housing officials in the post-war period often kind of were focused on the number of units, the number of, and it takes away that word house and home. It's now a unit. And so there's a bit of a bureaucratization around this. The learning didn't take place as well as it could have. Housing is not all that popular a political issue because of issues of race, NIMBYism, the desire for home ownership that Professor Connolly talked about, real estate opposition. I could talk about that at length, but I think race cannot be underestimated. Finally, the federal government, though, and housing are intimately entwined. That there is this market failure. The market cannot solve this problem by itself because some people cannot afford enough, don't make enough money to afford a house and maintain that house, the cost of it, or that home. The federal government is all over the housing production and affordability issues. We have tax policy. You mentioned the LIHTC program, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. We're subsidizing mortgages. The idea that the market is free here is just really a false one. And I'll end on that and open it up for conversation.
Okay. I have a bunch of questions, but first let me open it up to the three of you. Is there anything you want to throw at each other?
I just wanted to reinforce something that Nathan referenced that I didn't really talk about that I think is important, many of you may be aware of, which is that this sort of long-lasting discrimination and the lower rent rates of homeownership among African Americans and then a little less so Hispanics does lead to, has a real impact on the intergenerational wealth. And just to reinforce that you know, the value of homes, any of you may know from your own families, you know, homes that people bought for $40,000, $50,000, then sell for $500,000, whatever. That money then goes to the next generation and puts them in a very strong position vis-a-vis their own home ownership and the options that they have for college, for all the other things people spend money on. And so if you go back in this history and see that all those years of low home ownership plays out all the way to the present.
It's not only low home ownership, it's also the differential in the increase in the property values in black neighborhoods as opposed to white neighborhoods. You put the same house in two different neighborhoods and the appreciation rates end up being very different. Before I forget, if you have questions, you've got cards that were on your chair. Ben is there, ready to pick up the cards, and I am happy to sort through whatever we have. I think over here, Ben, just raise your hand quickly and he'll grab them from you. One of the things, well, was there anything else anybody else had? Just curious. No, yeah, well, one of the things I'm interested in, and then we'll get questions, is there's been a lot of conversation here about the New Deal. Mm-hmm. The New Deal was 90 years ago, and it is framing the analysis that all three of you are bringing to the table. 90 years before the New Deal is the 1840s. And I'm trying to imagine three people sitting in front of a group of congressional staff, which obviously at that time would have been considerably smaller, but three people sitting in front of a group of congressional staff in the 1930s talking about the 1840s and about what you can learn from the 1840s. Why is it that that this still sticks? And is that a good thing, maybe? Is it the level of experimentation, the level of imagination, and have we failed, in essence, our great-grandparents or whatever from the New Deal, in not being as creative, do you think, as they were? Or It's still shaping the discourse.
Yeah, I mean, here, I absolutely agree with that. And I oftentimes try to push back on folks who want to draw a direct line between redlining policies in the 30s and explaining the wealth gap in the 21st century, because there are a number of intervening steps that happen there. But, it's funny you should make that example about, what they were talking about in the 1930s probably wasn't the 1840s. And I don't know if that's true or not. I think about the visions of an ownership society, visions of democracy framed around, Jacksonian democracy in particular, the proliferation of people being able to have their own little plot of land and it being good for democracy. I feel like that was in the conversations in the 30s, right? The idea that our democracy needs to have people who are an engaged citizenry who have their own little plot of independence. That being said, I mean, I do think that there are ways in which the question around the New Deal really does leave us handcuffed, if only because I don't know what the political morale is now for really robustly creating, say, public option to help even out so many of the housing pressures that we've talked about, right? I mean, that was the one thing that always astounds me about the clarity of some of the housing policymakers in the 30s, is they're like, listen, you cannot have people paying more than 25% for their income in a house. Anything we do going forward has to be clear on that, and we will develop a public option in order to keep those kind of proportions down. And I don't know if we've got the same kind of energy or morale or creativity to think about the value of the public option in the housing sector to try to make places like Manhattan, where you have so many cash buyers propping up that market, or San Francisco or Miami, where you have to find some way to counteract the problem of high interest rates with something that looks like what public housing was talked about in that time period. And so it's a morale question in part. And
it's interesting you use the word public option, which strikes me as usually a healthcare term.
Right.
From the New Deal forward, the nation has gradually recognized that a major role of the federal government is to ameliorate the failures of the market. And I talked a lot about market failure. In healthcare, we're still struggling to get to that answer, but the federal government's all over the healthcare market. The federal government's all over the housing market. We have a public education system. There is this question of public and what's private, and it's gone up and down since the New Deal. And it's still the debate today. We're now in a more neoliberal mode where we want more public-private partnerships. But the conversation started in 1930 is still relevant. And what 1840, if we hadn't had the Civil War, would we still been talking about slavery all the way till, we still are talking about it, right? So if that was the issue in 1840, race relations is still the conversation.
But I think they would have looked back to the progressive era as the inspiration.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
And the big difference, what makes me feel pessimistic about today versus what the atmosphere was in the 1930s, I think people were excited about what the federal government could do. Mm-hmm. Not that everything was hunky-dory and not all those strategies worked. There was a lot of improvisation, a lot of failed programs in the 30s, but there was this sense that the federal government could come to the rescue, channeling it through local and state government, the point you made about the partnership with housing authorities. Today, I think there's just a lot of general cynicism about what government can or cannot do. And so I think we have a long road to travel, and inevitably there will need to still be those partnerships with municipalities and with states to make this palatable.
And what's interesting about that LIHTC program, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is doing most of the new construction today in affordable housing, is that's a U.S. Treasury program in partnership with states. HUD is just even trying to keep up with the numbers of what's going on, and it's really not a part of the most important low-income housing.
Because it's a tax strategy.
It's a tax strategy. That's how far we've come. In some ways, we're underestimating how neoliberal this is for. Yeah.
I'm not underestimating.
Maybe I'm sure.
I mean, it's interesting, and I'll go on to some questions here. Actually, as Nathan, especially you were talking, it occurred to me that actually in the 30s, they were thinking about the 1840s because the what's a house was a Jacksonian notion of the family farm, right? I mean, and so oddly enough, they did have their heads stuck in the 1940s, and maybe that is part of what shaped. All three of you have emphasized racial politics but it's been a black and white racial politics.
Yeah.
What happens when Latino immigration, other immigration, but especially Latinos, gets thrown into that mix of what the three of you have argued is a set of policies and practices that are deeply embedded in race, but it's been a dichotomous race so far?
Yeah. So this is something I've had to think a lot about.
With Miami, obviously, you had to think of this.
Yeah. So one of the things that I oftentimes say in having studied Miami is that Miami's past is America's future. Because what happens there is an infusion of, obviously, exiles who were leaving the Cuban Revolution in the 1960s, but Miami's history has always been Caribbean, really from its establishment. And so what you see there is the strength and the saliency of the black-white binary being mapped onto people who come from a variety of cultural backgrounds and understandings and linguistic groups and so forth, right? And so, reading things from like Jim Crow era high schools where you have high school publications written in 3 languages, right? Or understanding the ways in which, again, this is key in South Florida, you can find ways of bringing folks from Argentina, Brazil, Dominican Republic, and funneling them into neighborhoods that are largely orchestrated along black and white lines. My other favorite statistic about this is, of course, the more recent immigration around, say, African immigrants, right? So between 1990 and 2005, more Africans came to North America than during the entire run of the transatlantic slave trade in just that 15-year period. And what it led to was the kind of predatory stuff I'm describing in PG County, where a lot of African immigrants are moving in. They're buying, nice middle-class homes.
Prince George's County, for those of you who haven't been here very long.
But in other words, all that to say, even being a relatively new immigrant does not leave one exempt or protected from old-style predations, right? So that's why I really think it's important to look at how, if you have a concentration of people who are of color, or you see zoning or even local control begin to break down for all kinds of reasons that have to do with state-level power or other kinds of political structures that we tend not to think about if we only focus exclusively on the federal, which I think is another piece of this conversation. But there is absolutely a kind of geographic determinacy that makes the black-white binary a powerful one for then setting costs and determining experiences for everybody.
I did mention, though, that that discrepancy in home ownership rates between Hispanics, Latinos, and African Americans, 44% of blacks, 51% of Hispanics. And I think that is a very important statistic. And if you looked at small business ownership, you'd probably see similar things. And I think it suggests some of the divide and some of the political differences between Latinos and African Americans, that for a variety of reasons, would be another whole session, the Latino situation is somewhat different economically.
And Latinos have struggled to have access to public housing developments and have had to kind of sue housing authorities to gain more access. And it's only been in the last 2 decades that they have started to participate in these programs in the state.
So you mentioned public housing authorities, and a couple questions here, if you combine them. One of the interesting questions seems to be whether or not it matters what the local housing authorities do. If you were to be able to commission a historical study of 50 metropolitan housing authors, would you learn anything?
Oh, I think you would see a wide range of the types of housing authorities. First of all, there are small housing. The state of Georgia and the state of Alabama have more housing authorities total number than any other states, because all sorts of small towns and counties formed housing authorities, and they're running 300 units, 200 units, these small things, and they're doing fairly well. Let's just relative sense. And then you have large housing authorities. You'd have large, small. You learn that it's hard to do this at scale. It's hard to manage 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 units at scale at a large bureaucracy. That housing takes those managers on the ground in the building, and that's a difficult bureaucracy to run. That's what I think. But I don't.
I would just add a few things. In a city like Boston, of course, those were jobs that were part of the political machine for a long time.
Yeah, but Chicago has no political machine.
No, yeah.
So this is,
But I do think that, you know, and it has made it right now. We have a new person who's a young Harvard undergraduate. She was on the city council. She's a real housing nerd, and she's just been named by our Mayor Wu to be head of the housing authority. And she's very ambitious, and but it's a question also of resources that you have to work with. And this rehab problem that we keep coming back to is major. And it's going to take, and then with the absence of the money to actually do what's needed to fix those elevators, to renovate these apartments, it pushes people to these public-private partnerships, to the Hope 6 kinds of solutions where often the public housing piece shrinks, the subsidized housing shrinks, so that it's in the face of that lack of resources that we come up with some of these solutions that don't serve low-income people as well as they should.
One of the things that I would just add to this is that, again, I think it's important that we don't necessarily divide when we're talking about the public housing authorities from what the impact is on the private market, because these housing authorities oftentimes have the power to issue condemnation orders that then claim parts of private real estate and help then ripple affect the prices of the entire region. And so the story that we talk about, downwardly mobile, working class suburbs of color, is the story of these places then being site selected for public housing projects with horrible effects for the ability of those neighborhoods to then accumulate equity and so on and so forth, right? Or it helps to set the ways in which the surrounding elite communities or prestigious communities can hold their value. And so again, there are inequalities that get built into the public housing program and how they determine what makes for disruptive or undisruptive development.
so it's interesting if you again, the racial division becomes central. And one of the questions, and I suspect it's more than one person who is thinking about this in this audience as I look at the group, and I'm quoting now from the question, millennials' expectations of housing options and home ownership are bleak. So now we've introduced generational issues as well as racial and ethnic. And what I'm curious about is, as historians, has there been any point in our history when a generation of people between the ages of 20 and 35, say, have had a, quote, bleak sense of their future in the housing markets? Is this something new?
I got a good idea, but
Go.
Well, one is right in that post-war moment when there's a tremendous housing shortage. You mentioned it. We'd had a depression, no new housing built, a war, no new housing built, and families were forming, and they were eager to form, and then there was this housing shortage. And what happens? The federal government steps up. It steps up and says, we're going to, they tried all sorts of things, some worked, some didn't, to increase the amount of construction. We're in a similar housing crisis in certain parts of the country, mainly metropolitan regions, and there's not a political outcry to step up and build more houses. Does it take that?
The other thing is, I don't think it's just housing. I mean, we're hearing more broadly that, you know, this is a generation or the last several coming up that have felt that they won't necessarily live as well as their parents. So I don't think it's just housing. It can be income and opportunities, you know, in the larger society.
I got one more generational thing. Senior housing became very popular in cities in the 1960s after that initial binge of family housing was built in the 40s and 50s. And why senior housing? Because those people vote. They aren't disruptive. They don't have kids.
They're not a threat.
They're not a threat.
They're not a
They're not
threat.
sending kids to school.
They're not sending kids to school. And they were organized in a way. And so that's a generation.
Do we know historically whether the opposition to senior public housing has been anything even resembling the opposition? I mean, your book on Logue, I mean, when they tried to build, even for firemen and teachers in Westchester County, all the communities said, no, we don't even want that.
If you look at another example is what happened when the Mount Laurel decisions in New Jersey, which mandated that communities have a certain portion of housing for affordable housing, and many communities welcomed senior housing because they said, well, we'll fulfill our Mount Laurel obligation with senior housing, and those people won't have kids in the schools won't need to be expanded, the property taxes won't have to go up, et cetera, et cetera. So, in fact, it was quite the opposite from what you suggest. Not opposition, but
welcoming.
embrace.
So, in a way, and then we need to cut this off, earlier reference to humanistic approaches to public housing. This is the social science approach, which is if we start reducing our variables. Right here we have a solution to a housing crisis, a housing problem, and we've gotten rid of the variable of school taxes. We've gotten rid of the variable of people being worried about crime. We're sort of chopping away at the variables, and we find out that people are fine with it, which is
not always.
Not all. Okay.
I believe it was David Chappelle, the comedian who was very publicly opposing housing development in Ohio because it was partly folded into a bait and switch approach. Like folks will say about a massive gentrification or redevelopment, and they'll include senior housing as a kind of gateway piece to justify the project that might actually have really horrible consequences broadly. And so the question is not just senior housing or
but which type?
What type and what is it connected to in terms of larger scale projects?
So I think on this we're going to bring it to a close. Unfortunately, I tried to get to my questions, but many of you did not get your questions answered. I'm sure that our three panelists would be happy to speak to you individually after we close the session. I don't know what time Brad's plane is. I want to encourage all of you to go to the table outside the doors, pick up the handout if you don't have it already, along with the stickers, the pens, and all the other stuff we throw away, and information about future briefings. We hope to see you at the next AHA Congressional Briefing, which will be on the history of sanctions. And that's going to be sometime in the first 2 months of 2024. Precision on that is not essential right now. The subject might be described as timeless. So we're flexible in terms of thinking about when our speakers can come to DC. And we will have other sessions in the spring. Please, if you have suggestions, if you are aware that there's something coming down the pike, something your office is dealing with, something that we would have no idea is coming along, but you know it is because your boss is saying, we've got to talk about this, or there's some piece of legislation snaking through your office that no one's ever heard of, please let us know, and we can find experts, historical experts on anything. So thank you for coming.
Good.